Hey all, welcome to Running from 40. And in this video, we're going to be continuing our series on getting started with running. So, last video we went over running form. This one's going to be about running volume and intensity. And get ready because it's going to be intense like the circus. Haha, get it? Anyhow, running volume and intensity. Running volume, how much you run. Running intensity, how hard you run. So some of you, after the last video, might have been really excited. You got out, you're running, everything feels great until it doesn't. And you're exhausted and you're like, how could I possibly sustain this? Well, if that's true, or you're just interested in watching more, today's video is for you. So running volume. Okay, so starting out, the only consideration given to running volume should be that you're not running too much. Just start out really, really low and slow. And yeah, I think my first week running, I ran like 8 to 12 miles. I might have ran like a 2 mile day. And I'm kind of a go-getter too. So really, we talked about walking, we talked about jogging. For the first, probably until you're running over 15, 20 miles a week, you just want to go at a very reasonable pace as far as your volume building goes. How many miles you're running and how you're building that. So, but once you start running a little bit more, maybe you've been running for a couple months, you say to yourself, well, I eventually want to run more. Maybe I have these goals. I want to run a 5K or a 10K or a half marathon or a marathon or some amount of running that you know is going to require you to increase your volume. And you say, well, how do I do that? So, as far as calculating volume goes, some of you may know there's a fairly well known formula of kind of like a rule, 10% rule. Like we talked about in the last video, there are these general principles, and this is one of them. And it's a pretty decent way, high level, to think about how you're building your running volume week after week. And what it looks like is this 10% rule. You run a certain amount the first week, let's say 20 miles. The next week, you run 10% more. So that'd be 2 miles more. So you're running 22 miles the next week. And you do that for 3 weeks, increasing volume each week. And then on week number 4, you either pause increasing your volume or you do what I would call a step back week, pretty much like a rest week, where you may reduce your running volume by as much as 30 to 40%. But like I said, this is uh, this is not a perfect specific plan for everyone. We're all different and we're all at different places. And so I would say a couple of things. First of all, this approach is not meant to be indefinite. It's it may be for someone, but for most people, I think you're going to start running, you're going to start trying to increase, and then you're going to find this level that you hit where you recognize it would be good for me to just slow down a bit, to not increase anymore, to hang out around this volume for a while. For me, I just recently went from 30 miles a week to 50 miles a week over probably less than 2 months. And it's actually almost less than a month. I mean, I built up pretty quickly, maybe like 6 weeks, no more than 2 months for sure. And looking back, I wish I would have stopped after I built from 30 to 40. I wish I would have hung out at 40 for like a month. So, again, one of the biggest requirements here is to just be in tune with the process, to be constantly asking yourself, how are you doing? And to not turn your brain off, to really be discerning, is this working? So it's a high level rule that usually works for most people, but you need to develop some skill in applying it. So maybe a good recommendation is build up 10% per week for 3 weeks, take your step back. But then after you've built up about 10 miles, take a step back month. Just take a whole month where you say you've built from 20 to 30, just hang out at 30 for a month. And then start building up to 40 and then just hang out there. At the end of the day, how many miles you should be running will vary based on your goals. If you want to run shorter or longer races, but also just based on what you're able to sustain. Some people are high mileage people. Some people will find themselves getting injured once they go over maybe 50 or 60 miles per week. And to some of you, that might sound insane. It did to me like a year ago, but now I find myself right around 50 miles a week. And again, it's incremental, it's gradual, it's bit by bit. We're building it up, so it's never extreme. It's always this slow growth. It's the small investments that build up over time. So one thing I do really, really want to point out, and this is going to transition into our next point on intensity, is not all miles are created equal. So one of the questions of how many miles should I be running? How quickly can I build up the amount of miles I run? One of the answers, the responses to that has to be, well, what intensity are you running at? And you can prove this point real simply with just the following illustration. Imagine walking a mile, however briskly, but you're walking it, and then imagine running that same mile all out. It doesn't take much common sense to realize, hey, this is harder when I'm running all out. It's got a higher impact on my body. It hurts my body more. It's harder to breathe. And so you can't just look at it so statically and say, how many miles should I be running? It also matters how hard you're running those miles, what your effort is that you're putting into running those miles. Now, I bring this up because, and I say it should be common sense, but we have to understand that when you're in the midst of learning something, I often see this. I mean, it wasn't common sense to me, I guess, right? I kind of overdid it. When I was once told by a professor of mine that when you're learning something new, it's like you're in the fog. You can't see anything around. Everything feels confusing and disorienting. And so when you're learning running, and if it's new to you and you're thinking about all these different components, maybe if you step back, it would make good, plain sense. But when you're in the midst of it, you're overwhelmed, and some things that might seem very obvious or simple just aren't as obvious or simple. And this is one of those things. So, what should our intensity be when we're running? Again, high level, in general, your intensity should look very, very low. And probably for the first 6, 12, maybe even 36 months. It really depends. And why am I saying this? I'm not saying this because I think you're slow and out of shape. And if you do any more, you're just going to get hurt. I mean, you will hear me mention don't go too hard because you might get injured. But it's not just because I have a poor view of your abilities and I want to keep you fragile and from getting injured. It's actually the very best way to get better at running. And that's good news because running slow doesn't sound quite as scary as running fast. And while it's debated how much running should be slow, how much should be of a higher intensity, what exactly that looks like, it is a universally agreed upon point that the majority of our running, whoever we are, from elite to brand new running neophyte, your runs should mostly be at an easy pace. And the reason is because you need to develop your aerobic base. If somebody went and just ran real, real intense, and I think a lot of us would see somebody who's just going all out and we're like, oh man, that looks really hard. Maybe they will get hurt, but they're probably getting themselves into great shape. The truth of the matter is they're actually bypassing their aerobic conditioning. And for an endurance athlete, having a good aerobic base, an aerobic engine is extremely important. And this isn't just something that some people feel strongly about. This has been shown in research time and time again. Dr. Steven Seiler, who I think is from Texas originally, he did some studies in Norway. He went to Norway and he first studied cross-country skiers, but he's also looked at a lot of other endurance athletes. And he found, so he's looking at elite athletes. He found that the training that they do can be kind of broken down into two categories, easy and intense. In those categories had this ratio of 80% to 20%. 80% of their working out, even these really, really fit people with extremely, insanely high aerobic systems and VO2 max and all that, 80% of their training is done at a relatively low intensity, and 20% of their training is done at a little bit of a higher intensity. And so that should be eye-opening. I mean, wow, that's so it's not just for us. It's not just for the pedestrian type athletes. It's for even the very, very best. So it's not just something you have to do kind of like you have the training wheels on. Everybody needs to do it. And I could even share with you my own example. A little bit over a year ago, I started running and I figured out what my pace should look like. I did it based on my heart rate. And let me tell you, I was running or actually walking a lot at a pace of about 14 minutes per mile, which is slow. I mean, most of you could probably run faster than that. You might not feel good after it. And I don't mean to be discouraging if somebody can't do a 14-minute per mile, but keep in mind, I was like somebody who hiked a decent amount, was in decent shape, and at the correct intensity, I was at a 14-minute per mile pace. I was like a snail. I have run almost all of my training for the last year. And that includes, we got sick a lot over the winter. I was injured once, not from running, I don't think, but it certainly was exacerbated by running and affected my running. And excuse me, a year later, at that same heart rate, that same effort, I went from a 14-minute mile to about an 8.5-minute mile. So now my easy runs are done at about an 8.5-minute mile. And I can run way faster than that. So it doesn't just make you good, like you have this good capacity for longer endurance events. It actually gives you more aerobic capacity to even do shorter events, to where I went from, I mean, my 5K time, I could probably run around a 20-minute 5K, which is respectable. And I don't say that to brag. I say that is just even my own sort of anecdotal evidence that what you see in research is actually proven true for me, and I know a lot of others. So at this point, maybe I've motivated you some. Maybe you're willing to not give up. Maybe you want to give up after just getting out and giving it a go. But then you still left with this question. Okay, great. You've motivated me. I'm willing to take what you're saying and believe that it's true. But how do I do it? And that's the $1,000,000 question. Well, actually, in this case, it's a very simple answer. You do it with biofeedback, really the feedback that your body gives. And so what does that look like? Well, the reason we need biofeedback and the reason we need a good way to get that biofeedback is because most of us don't have a very good sense of the effort that we're putting into something athletically. We normally are going to overdo it, even if we're told to just go for an easy run. So it's because that's not very accurate. How do we capture that biofeedback better? How do we evaluate, quantify, so on and so forth? I would say the simplest, cheapest, easiest way to think about this would be breathing rate. Now, technology is exploring stuff like breathing rate more, but it's not quite as popular as heart rate, which we'll talk about in a minute. But it's simple. Breathing rate practically looks like while you're running, or while you're walking briskly, or wherever you're starting out, can you do so at a conversational pace? Could you talk to somebody else? If they're with you, you can try it. You should be able to carry on a conversation. Not like you're sitting in a library and you're like trying to be that as quiet as you'd have to be in that context, where you feel bad because you're breathing a little bit heavy when you're talking. You're going to be breathing. You're doing something fitness related, but you shouldn't be huffing and puffing. You shouldn't be going, yeah. So the other day that's not conversational pace. Just because you can get a few words out, you're pushing really close to that anaerobic area where you're working out without oxygen. So that's not conversational. But again, can you carry on a conversation? Could you sing a song maybe? I actually think through some of these YouTube videos while I'm running, and I start to talk through them. And I'm able to do so. I'm able to sustain that while running. So that's just a really simple way to think about what your effort actually is. Uh, Contrast with what you might think it is just off the top of your head based on how you feel. Now, when I started out, I went a little further than this. And so I bring up that first one just because it's the most low tech, kind of simple approach. What I did right away was I got myself a Coros Pace 2 GPS watch and a chest strap heart rate monitor, and connected the heart rate monitor to my watch and was able to see my heart rate very accurately. But you really don't even need to go that intense. Now, it's not that, I mean, it depends if you want gadgets or not. I like gadgets. Some of you may be Luddites. It's okay. But if you do have like a Fitbit or an Apple Watch or something like that, you don't need an external monitor. You can actually, the optical monitors in these devices are getting so good that you really can just take your band and just tighten it. And I would say tighten it to where you can't fit a finger in there at all, just during your workout. And really, a lot of the heart rate sensors these days, even these optical sensors that are put in watches or armband monitors, are becoming so much more accurate, especially when you're not doing like interval work and you're just doing a consistent pace. But you could graduate to like a chest strap monitor. That's going to be the gold standard. And that's going to get you a more accurate number. Okay, those are some ways you can think about biofeedback. If it comes down to your heart rate monitor, all right, I know how to do that, but what's the heart rate that I should be aiming for? Well, there are a variety of ways that you can calculate this. You can even go to a lab, which again would be like this gold standard of giving you your lactate threshold and your max heart rate and all your zones and everything. But you don't have to get that intense. There are a variety of formulas. Some of them depend on max heart rate. Some of them require a bit of a fitness test, and they're all good possibilities and varying difficulties associated with them. But I'm going to suggest for most people, a very conservative approach would be to use the MAF heart rate method. It's developed by Dr. Phil Maffetone, and the MAF does not stand for his last name. It actually stands for maximum aerobic. That I just totally blank out. Maximum aerobic. Where is the F at? Where did that even go? Maximum aerobic function. There you go. Maximum aerobic fitness, maximum aerobic. I don't know. That's crazy. But yeah, maximum aerobic function heart rate. And the way you calculate that, there's a bit of a worksheet that you can use. And it is as simple as taking the number 180, subtracting your age, and then there are a few extra criteria that you can add or subtract numbers from that number, and you can get a heart rate that you should be working out at. For me, it was right around 140, and that's my MAF heart rate. And that corresponded really well to me doing another test with a max heart rate. So, but it's conservative, I would say, for most people. And I've heard, anecdotally at least, that people's MAF heart rates have been fairly close to what they've gotten even from a lab test. So there you have it. Again, a recap. We talked today about running volume and intensity. How much and how often? Did I say how often? No. How much and how hard? I actually had how often written in my notes, but how much and how hard you're running. Our next video in this series on getting started with running is going to be on warm up, cool down, and recovery. Something that we may want to neglect, we might not think are as important as the first two video subject matter, but those are really important things. So we're going to go over them. But until then, thank you so much for watching. I hope you have an excellent rest of your day. Until we talk to you again, take care, y'all.